Now here we will look at some basic transition words and phrases for indicating uncertainty. The first transition word is although, which is normally used at the beginning of a sentence or between two clauses. And we can also use though or even though, which all have a similar meaning. Though is more formal and it is used at the beginning of a sentence, but a little more informal when used between two clauses. Even though is more emphatic and it is informal when used between two clauses. Examples: although her job is hard, her salary is low. Or we can say, though her salary is hard, though her job is hard, her salary is low. Or even though her job is hard, her salary is low. And we can restate or rephrase the same example saying her salary is low although her job is hard, or her salary is low though her job is hard, or her salary is low even though her job is hard. The next example: although Stephen was extremely tired, he washed the dishes. The next example: although he has got a good job, he still complains. Next: I felt he was wrong, although I didn't say so. And the last example using although is: although small, the kitchen is well designed. Now we have also an example using although this may be true. The example reads like this: I don't believe this, although this may be true. The next transition phrase is on the other hand, which is used to introduce a fact or opinion that contrasts with the fact or opinion before it. Examples: on the one hand, expansion would be good, but on the other hand, it would be sad to lose the family atmosphere. Next: on the one hand, they would love to have kids, but on the other hand, they don't want to give up their freedom. And the last example: it's a nice place to visit, on the other hand, it's rather expensive. We had these examples before, but we are using them here for indicating uncertainty. Now here we have some more transition words used for indicating uncertainty. The first one is subsequently, which means afterwards, later, after something else has happened. Examples: the original interview notes were subsequently lost. The next example, we are starting with the word subsequently. Notice that we use a comma after it. Subsequently, new guidelines were issued to all employees. And the last example, he subsequently became chairman of the party. Notice the use of subsequently between the subject and the verb. The next transition is yet, or sometimes we use and yet for more emphasis. Examples: it's a small car, yet which means nevertheless, yet it's surprisingly spacious. He has a good job, and yet he never seems to have any money. The next example, he didn't study hard, and yet passed the final exam. The next example, the weather was cold, and yet it was bright and sunny. And the last example, her advice seems strange, and yet I do believe she is right. And the last transition is nevertheless, which means despite something that you have just mentioned. Examples here. Notice the use of nevertheless at the beginning of a second sentence or between the two clauses. The first example, it's a difficult race, nevertheless about 1,000 runners participate each year. Next example, the old system had its flaws, but nevertheless it was preferable to the new one. And the next example, I know he has some bad habits. I know he has some bad habits. Nevertheless, you shouldn't be so rude to him. And the last example, I'm not able to go to the beach with you. Nevertheless, thanks for asking me. Now we are looking at the last slide on transition words and phrases for indicating uncertainty. The first transition phrase is then again, which simply means one more time, or it means something happening next. The first example, I suppose Mary might help. Then again, she might not. Notice the use of the semicolon to join the two short sentences here. The next example, there is no evidence for the existence of UFOs. Then again, there have been numerous reported sightings of UFOs. Notice here that the two sentences are long, so we put a full stop and started the second sentence with the transition phrase then again. The next transition is conversely, which is used for introducing a sentence or part of a sentence which says something that is the opposite of the other part. Examples: some wrong answers were marked right, and conversely, some right answers had been rejected. The second example, when the press was biased towards the political right, television coverage tended to lean to the left. Conversely, if the press swung heavily to the left, television would have to redress the balance by leaning to the right. The next transition is albeit, which simply means like although, and it is used for introducing comment that slightly changes or reduces the effect of what you said before it. Examples: he finally agreed, albeit reluctantly, to help us. The second example, the United States finally agreed, albeit unwillingly, to support the UN action. And the last transition here is while, which is used to compare and contrast facts before a statement that is true, but it's not as important as the statement that follows it. Examples: my brother is good at sciences while I am good at languages. The next examples, most of which start with while. While I understand your opinion, there is nothing I can do to help you. Next, while most children learn to read easily, some need extra help. While Tom is very good at science, his brother is absolutely hopeless. Next example, while Missy was driving to work, she saw a deer by the roadside. And we've got 3 more examples using while. The first one is, while in Australia, she met and married Bert. The next one, she had sprained her ankle while playing tennis. And the last example, you can go swimming while I'm having lunch. Now in the next 2 slides we will look at some basic transition words and phrases used for indicating time, chronology, or sequence. The first one is at first, which means at the beginning. Examples: I didn't like the job much at first. The second example: at first I thought he was shy, but then I discovered he was just not interested in other people. The next transition phrase is in the meantime, which means in the period of time between 2 times or 2 events. Examples: my first novel was rejected by 6 publishers. In the meantime, I had written a play. The next example: the next program starts in 5 minutes. In the meantime, here is some music. The transition after, which means after at a time later than something, or when something has finished. Examples: was he on a visit to the neighboring country or going home after the summer program? The next example: several years after they had split up, they met again by chance in Paris. The next transition is next, which means after something else, or then, or afterwards. Examples: after me, he is the next tallest boy in the class. Another example: the next best thing to flying is gliding. Next example: next time I will bring a book. And the last example: I fainted, and the next thing I knew, I was in hospital. Now the last transitional phrase here is up to the present time. Example: up to the present time, I have finished reading most of the story. Notice the use of this transitional phrase at the beginning of the sentence, or we can use it at the end. In this second and last slide on basic transition words and phrases for indicating time, chronology, or sequence, we will look at 5 transition words and phrases. The first one is at the same time, which means at one time or together. Examples: I was watching TV last night and at the same time I was listening to what my brother was saying. Next example, she was crying and laughing at the same time. Next, at the same time that Beethoven was composing brilliant musical compositions, Haydn was also writing brilliant pieces. The next transition is since, which is used with the present perfect or past perfect from a time in the past until a later past time or until now. Examples: Kathy has not phoned since she went to Berlin. Next example: how long is it since we last went to the theater? Next, Paul has had several different jobs since he left school. And the last one, the current levels were put in place in 1991 and have not changed since then. The next transition is recently, which means not long ago. We received a letter from him recently. Or another example, I have not seen them recently. And we can use recently between the subject and the verb. So we can say we have recently received a letter from him. The next transition is simultaneously, which means happening or done at the same time as something else. Examples: there were several simultaneous attacks by the rebels. The next example, any ceasefire would be simultaneous with the withdrawal of US forces. And the last transition is during, which means at some point in a period of time, all through a period of time. Examples: he was taken to hospital during the night. The next example, I saw her only once during my stay in London. Now, in the last two slides, we will look at some basic transition words and phrases used for concluding or summarizing. The first one is in conclusion, which is used in writing or formal speech, showing that the next thing you say will be the last thing you say. Example: in conclusion, I would like to thank everyone who helped me to make this event possible. The next transition phrase is to sum up, which means to give a summary or a short statement of something. Examples: her reply seemed to sum up the attitude of all the refugees. The next example, we are starting with the transition phrase. To sum up, notice the comma. To sum up, there are three main ways of tackling the problem. The next transition is finally, which means after a long time. Examples: the performance finally started half an hour late. The next example, when they finally arrived, it was well past midnight. The next transition phrase is on the whole, and it is used to introduce the last thing in a list of things. Examples: it was a pretty good conference on the whole. The second example, on the whole, notice the comma, on the whole, she felt that the report was fair. The next transition phrase is as can be seen. Example: as can be seen from the table, a large number of people prefer watching football matches than watching movies. And the last transition phrase in this slide is in the final analysis. And there are two examples here. The first one, in the final analysis of the data, notice the comma again, in the final analysis of the data, some significant results were obtained. The next example, as can be seen in the final analysis, the invention of electricity brought profound changes in our lives. Now we come to the second and last slide on transition words and phrases used for concluding or summarizing. The first transition phrase is all in all, which is used for showing that you are considering every aspect of something. Example: all in all, I think it has been a very successful conference. The next transition is therefore, which is used to introduce the result of something, and it is more formal and used at the beginning of a second sentence or between two clauses, and is often followed by a comma. Examples: we had lost our tickets, therefore we couldn't see the show. The next example is the same one but joining them together with a conjunction. So we say we had lost our tickets and therefore we couldn't see the show. The next example is I no longer have the support of the committee. I have therefore decided to resign. The next transition phrase is in brief, which means in short. Examples: the plan is to change the radio station's style. In brief, less talk and more music. The next example: I only heard the news in brief. And the last transition phrase is and thus, which means in this way or like this. Examples: no decision had been made, and thus the situation remained unclear. Another example: fewer pupils will attend the schools, and they will thus need fewer teachers. The next example: some had removed all the evidence, thus it was now impossible for the police to consider their investigation. And the last example: the oil producers will raise prices, thus increasing their profits. Now we have come to the end of this video, which I hope has helped you understand some basic transition words and phrases and how to use them in writing your paragraphs and essays. Good luck to you.